The smell of ashes never left Petro Kovalenko's hands, no matter how many times he scrubbed them in the cold stream water. He knelt in what used to be his home, sifting through blackened wood and broken pottery, searching for anything that survived the fire. His fingers closed around a thin gold band buried in the dirt. His wife's wedding ring. She had been wearing it the day the NKVD came for him in 1938, 3 years that felt like 30. She was not wearing it when they buried her in the mass grave outside the village in 1933, during the Holodomor famine that Stalin engineered to break Ukraine's spirit. Petro stood slowly, his knees cracking for months in the Siberian labor camp. The village of Kolodyazyne stretched before him like a graveyard pretending to be alive. Half the houses stood empty, their owners dead or disappeared. The Soviet collectivization program had stripped every farm of its grain, every family of its hope. Between 1932 and 1933, nearly 4 million Ukrainians starved while Soviet officials confiscated their harvest and sealed the borders so no one could escape. Petro's wife Alina had fed their children bark soup and grass porridge until there was nothing left to give. His daughter Oksana, now 15, remembered everything. His son had not survived to remember anything at all. "Father," Oksana called from the doorway of their neighbor's house where they now lived. Her voice carried the flatness of someone who had seen too much death too young. "Commissar Volkov is in the square. He wants the grain quota." Petro felt his jaw tighten. The quota. Always the quota. Even after the famine. Even after the purges that took Father Dmitro's brother and the school teacher and anyone who spoke Ukrainian too loudly, the Soviet state demanded more. The collective farm had barely produced enough to feed the village this year, but Moscow did not care about empty bellies in Ukraine. They cared about feeding Leningrad and Moscow, about exporting grain to show the world how successful communism was. Even as millions starved in the countryside, he walked to the square where villagers gathered like nervous cattle. Commissar Volkov stood on the steps of the village Soviet building, a portly man with cold eyes and a pistol on his hip. 2 NKVD soldiers flanked him, their rifles ready. Everyone knew what happened to villages that failed to meet the quota. More arrests, more deportations, more shallow graves in the forest. "The state requires 8 tons of wheat," Volkov announced in Russian, refusing to speak Ukrainian. "You have 3 days to deliver it to the collection point." Old Mikola, who had lost his entire family to the famine, stepped forward with his cap in his hands. "Comrade Commissar, we have only 5 tons. If we give you 8, we will starve again." Volkov's face showed no emotion. The state does not negotiate with kulaks and wreckers. 8 tons. 3 days. "We are not kulaks," Mikola said, his voice rising. "We have nothing. You took everything in 33. You took my wife, my children, the rifle, but caught him across the face before he finished." Mikola fell hard, blood streaming from his broken nose. No one moved to help him. Movement attracted attention, and attention brought death. Petro felt Oksana's hand grip his arm, holding him back. She had learned the same lesson he had. Survival meant silence. That night, in the darkness of their borrowed room, Father Dmitro visited. The priest's face had aged 20 years in the past decade. He carried a battered ledger hidden beneath his cassock. "I kept records," he whispered, opening the book to show page after page of names written in tiny script. Every person who died in the famine. Every family destroyed. 4,000 souls from our district alone. The Soviets say it never happened, but I wrote it down. Someone must remember." Petro stared at the names. His wife's name, his son's name, neighbors, friends, people he had known his entire life. All murdered by deliberate starvation, a weapon more efficient than bullets. "Why show me this now?" Petro asked. Father Dmitro closed the book carefully. "Because war is coming. The Germans are pushing east. I heard from a priest in Lviv. The Wehrmacht is 100 kilometers away, maybe less. The Soviets are preparing to retreat." Oksana sat up from her thin mattress in the corner. Will the Germans be better than the Soviets? The question hung in the air like smoke. Father Dmitro looked at Petro, and Petro looked at his daughter. How could anything be worse than what they had endured? The famine, the purges, The terror. The Soviets had made Ukraine a charnel house where speaking your own language could get you shot as a nationalist, where owning a few extra acres before collectivization branded you a kulak deserving of death, where children informed on their parents and neighbors vanished in the night. I don't know, Father Dmitro finally said. But I know this: if the Soviets retreat and we stay, they will consider us collaborators when they return. If we flee with them, we abandon our land to strangers. Either way, we are trapped. Through the thin walls, they heard truck engines starting in the distance. Soviet military vehicles moving west toward the front. Artillery rumbled like distant thunder, getting closer each night. The war that had consumed Poland and France was finally reaching Ukraine, and with it came a terrible question that every person in Kaladayas had to answer for themselves. Was any occupier better than the one who had already killed so many of them? Petro held his wife's wedding ring up to the lamplight. In the morning, he would have to decide whether to bury it with her memory or carry it into whatever came next. Outside, the June night smelled of summer wheat and approaching smoke. History was turning like a great wheel, and people like Petro were caught between the spokes, powerless to stop it, desperate to survive it. The war was coming, and with it, the cruelest hope of all, that their enemy's enemy might be their salvation. The first German tank rolled into Kaladayas at dawn on June 28, 1941, 6 days after Operation Barbarossa shattered the Soviet frontier. Petro watched from behind his shutters as the Panzer III rumbled down the dirt road, its engine growling like a mechanical beast, its gray-green armor covered in dust from hundreds of kilometers of conquest. The swastika painted on its turret seemed impossible, unreal, like a nightmare symbol invading daylight. Behind it came trucks filled with Wehrmacht soldiers, their faces young and sunburned, their rifles resting casually across their laps, as if they were on a summer outing rather than invading the largest country on earth. Commissar Volkov had fled in the night, along with the NKVD officers and party officials. They had taken everything of value they could carry and burned the rest. The village Soviet building still smoldered, its Red Star flag torn down and trampled in the mud. Soviet soldiers had retreated eastward in chaos, some throwing away their weapons and uniforms, others simply disappearing into the forests. Stalin's Great Red Army, which had crushed Poland and terrorized Finland, was collapsing under the German blitzkrieg like a house of cards. The Wehrmacht had advanced 300 kilometers in less than a week, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Petro heard his door creak open. Maxim, his neighbor and childhood friend, stood there with wild eyes and a blue and yellow Ukrainian flag in his hands. Petro, come. We must show them we are not Soviets. We are Ukrainians. We have been waiting for this moment. Have we? Petro asked quietly. God, yes, Maxim said, his voice trembling with emotion. They killed my father in 1937 for owning 3 cows. 3 cows made him a kulak enemy of the people. The Germans are here to free us from the Bolsheviks. This is our liberation. In the square, a crowd was gathering. Petro watched in disbelief as old women brought out bread and salt on embroidered cloths, the traditional Ukrainian welcome for honored guests. Someone had hung a banner that read, "Long live independent Ukraine," in Ukrainian, German, and broken Russian. Young men who had hidden their nationalist sympathies for years now shouted openly in their native language. Father Dmitro emerged from the church, which the Soviets had converted into a grain warehouse, and began ringing the bells for the first time in a decade. A German officer climbed down from his command vehicle, a tall man with a weather-beaten face and captain's insignia. Hauptmann Weber. He introduced himself in broken Russian. He looked uncomfortable with the welcome, but accepted the bread and salt with a stiff nod. Through an interpreter, he promised order, protection, and respect for private property. He said Germany was not at war with the Ukrainian people, only with Jewish Bolshevism. The crowd cheered at this, though Petro noticed several families were conspicuously absent from the gathering. For 3 days, it seemed possible that Maxim was right. The Wehrmacht troops behaved with discipline. They paid an occupation currency for food. They helped repair the village well that had broken during the Soviet retreat. They did not loot or burn. Weber even posted guards to protect the harvest from deserting Soviet soldiers who roamed the countryside. Children cautiously approached the German soldiers, who gave them chocolate and tinned meat, luxuries the villagers had not seen in years. Oksana asked her father if they were finally safe. Petro could not answer. He watched everything with the wariness of a man who had learned that hope was a luxury that killed you. On the fourth day, the SS arrived. They came in separate trucks behind the regular army, men in black uniforms with death's head insignia and hard eyes that seemed to look at people as if they were counting livestock. SS Sturmbannführer Kraus set up headquarters in Volkov's former office. Within an hour, he had posted new orders on every building in the village. All Jews must register immediately. All former Communist Party members must report for interrogation. All weapons must be surrendered. Any resistance would be met with collective punishment. Petro felt his stomach turn to ice when he read the notices. The language was different from Soviet orders, but the threat was identical. Obey or die. The signs were printed in German, Ukrainian, and Yiddish, as if to make sure everyone understood exactly where they stood in the new hierarchy. That night, Petro watched as Rivka, the Jewish widow who lived 3 houses down, covered her windows with blankets. She had 2 children, a boy and a girl, both younger than Oksana. Her husband had been a blacksmith before the Soviets arrested him as a Trotskyite in 1936. She had survived by being invisible, by never drawing attention, by making herself as small as possible in a world that devoured the noticeable. Father Dimitro came to Petro's house after dark, his face ashen. "I was wrong," he whispered. "God forgive me, I was wrong to ring those bells. I spoke with Weber. He says the SS operates independently. He says he cannot control them. He says we should not have welcomed them. What will happen to the Jews?" Oksana asked from the corner. Father Dimitro could not meet her eyes. Weber would not say, "But I have heard stories from Poland, from Lviv. The SS does not just register Jews. He stopped, unable to speak the words. Maxim had joined the auxiliary police that afternoon. He wore an armband now and carried a rifle the Germans had given him. He was drunk when he visited Petro the next morning, drunk and talking too fast, justifying himself before anyone accused him. "Someone has to keep order," he said. "The Soviets are regrouping. Partisans are already forming in the forest. If we do not cooperate, the Germans will burn the village like they did Berezivka. You should join us, Petro. Show them we are loyal. Show them we are not Bolsheviks." Petro looked at his friend and saw a stranger. "I am not anything," he said quietly. "I'm just a man trying to keep my daughter alive." "Then join us," Maxim insisted. "The SS trusts collaborators. They give us extra rations, protection. You think you can stay neutral? There is no neutral in this war. You're either with Germany or with Stalin. Choose." But Petro had already learned the terrible truth that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There was no choice that did not lead to damnation. The Soviets had starved his wife and murdered his friends. The Germans smiled while they sharpened their knives. Between them, Ukraine was being crucified, and the nails were being driven by hands that spoke both Russian and German. Liberation, Petro understood now, was just another word for a different kind of death. The sound that woke Petro was not loud, just persistent, a soft scratching at the barn wall like a rat trying to get in. He lay still for a moment in the pre-dawn darkness, listening. Another scratch, then silence. Then a child's muffled sob, quickly choked off. Petro's heart clenched. He knew that sound. He had heard Oksana make it during the famine years when hunger hurt too much for silence, but crying meant using energy they could not spare. He pulled on his boots and crossed the yard to the barn, carrying no light. The August moon was thin and offered little illumination. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and old wood and fear. He found a boy huddled in the far corner behind a broken plow, 8 years old maybe, with dark curly hair and eyes that were too large in his thin face. "Rivka est une gestation. David, please," the boy whispered in Ukrainian. "They took Mama. They took Sarah. I hid. I ran. Please." Petro knelt down slowly so he would not frighten the child further. 2 days earlier, the SS had assembled all registered Jews in the square. 83 people from Kolodayas and the surrounding farms. They had loaded them onto trucks and driven them into the forest. Later that afternoon, villagers heard machine gun fire coming from the ravine near Babanyar, where the old clay mines used to be. No one spoke of it. Speaking meant acknowledging what everyone knew, and acknowledging meant becoming complicit or becoming a target. "You cannot stay here," Petro said, but even as he spoke, he knew the boy had nowhere else to go. Every Jew in the region was being hunted. The Einsatz grew up in mobile killing squads followed behind the Wehrmacht like wolves following a herd, executing Jews, communists, Roma, anyone Berlin had declared undesirable. The killing was systematic, efficient, industrial. This was not random violence like the Soviet purges. This was something colder, more absolute that David's hands trembled as he gripped Petro's shirt. "My mama said you were a good man. She said you helped people during the bad winter. Please, I will be quiet. I will not eat much. Please." Petro heard footsteps outside the barn. He pulled David deeper into the shadows and put his hand over the boy's mouth. Through the gaps in the wall boards, he saw Maxim walking past with another auxiliary policeman, both carrying rifles, both weaving slightly from vodka. They were laughing about something, their voices too loud in the quiet morning. "Did you check Kovalenko's barn?" the other policeman asked. "Why would I?" Maxim replied. "Petro is not stupid enough to hide Jews. Schmidt thinks someone is. 3 families disappeared after the registration. Children do not vanish into air. Then Schmidt should search better." Maxim said, "I'm not going through every barn in Ukraine looking for Jew children." They moved on, their voices fading. Petro waited until he could not hear them anymore, then removed his hand from David's mouth. The boy was crying silently, his whole body shaking. Petro thought of his own son, dead at 7 from starvation, and felt something break inside his chest. "Stay here today," he whispered. "Do not make any sound. Tonight, I will bring food." He returned to the house as the sun rose. Oksana was awake, sitting by the window. She looked at her father and asked no questions, but he saw understanding in her eyes. She had always been too observant, too aware. The famine had taught her to notice everything because survival depended on knowing when danger approached. That afternoon, SS Rattenführer Schmidt came to the house with an interpreter. Schmidt was young, maybe 25, with pale blue eyes and the kind of face that should have been handsome, but was made ugly by absolute certainty. He believed in the Reich the way Commissar Volkov had believed in Stalin, with the faith of someone who had found meaning in obedience. "We are searching for hidden Jews," the interpreter translated. "You will cooperate." "I have no Jews here," Petro said. Schmidt walked through the house slowly, opening cupboards, looking under beds, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He paused at Oksana's corner, staring at her with an expression Petro did not like. She met his gaze without flinching, this girl who had survived the unsurvivable. "You were in a Soviet labor camp," Schmidt said. "Why did they arrest you?" "They said I was a Ukrainian nationalist. But you welcomed us when we arrived. You are loyal to Germany now." Petro understood the trap. If he said yes, he committed himself to collaboration. If he said no, he made himself a target. "I am loyal to my daughter," he said. "I want only to farm my land and be left alone." Schmidt smiled without warmth. No one is left alone in this war. He went outside and circled toward the barn. Petro felt sweat run down his back despite the cool morning. If Schmidt searched thoroughly, he would find David. If he found David, he would execute the boy immediately and probably burn the house as punishment for harboring Jews. Oksana gripped her father's arm, her fingernails digging into his skin. The barn door opened. Petro heard Schmidt moving inside, his boots on the wooden floor, boards creaking under his weight. Silence. Then more footsteps. Petro forced himself to breathe normally. Beside him, Oksana had stopped breathing entirely. Schmidt emerged, brushing hay from his uniform. "Your barn is a mess," he said through the interpreter. "You should clean it." He left without another word. Petro waited until the sound of his motorcycle faded completely before he allowed himself to collapse into a chair. His hands shook. Oksana ran to the barn and came back a moment later, her face white. "He is still there," she whispered. He did not move when Schmidt searched. He just stayed very still in the corner. That night, Father Dimitro visited with news. He had been secretly baptizing Jewish children and providing them with false Christian names and papers. There was an underground network of priests and sympathetic families hiding children across western Ukraine. It was dangerous, he said. The penalty for hiding Jews was death. But how could they call themselves Christians if they did nothing while children were murdered? I can take the boy, Father Dimitro offered. There is a family in the next village. Childless. They will say he is their nephew from Kiev, orphaned in the bombing. Petro looked at Oksana, and she looked back at him. They did not speak, but the conversation happened anyway in the silence between father and daughter. They both knew what Rivka had been. A neighbor. A woman who had lost her husband to Soviet terror, just as they had lost their wife and mother. A mother who had loved her children just as fiercely as Helena had loved hers. There was no difference between David and any child except the accident of birth that Berlin had decided made his life worthless. Tomorrow night, Petro said, I will bring him to the church after curfew. Maxim came by the next afternoon, drunk again, his eyes bloodshot and his hands shaking. He had been at the ravine yesterday, he said, helping the SS with security during the executions. He described what he saw in broken fragments, as if saying it out loud might exorcise the images from his mind. The pits, the bodies, the children. He vomited in Petro's yard and wept, and said he had no choice. The Germans would have killed him if he refused. He was just following orders. It was not his fault. Then whose fault is it? Petro asked quietly. Maxim looked at him with hollow eyes. I know you are hiding someone, he said. I can smell it on you. The guilt. Schmidt knows too. He's watching you. When he finds proof, he will not just kill the Jew. He will kill you. He will kill Oksana. Please, Petro, turn whoever you are hiding over to me. I will make it quick. Better me than Schmidt. Petro said nothing. Maxim stumbled away, still weeping, a man drowning in his own choices. That night, Petro carried David through the dark to Father Dimitro's church. The boy weighed almost nothing, all bones and fear. At the church door, Father Dimitro took the child gently and blessed Petro. You have saved one soul, the priest said. In this darkness, that is everything. Walking home, Petro knew it was not enough. It would never be enough. David was one child, and thousands were dying. But it was the only choice he could make that allowed him to remain human. Snow fell on Kaladayas. The morning Schmidt came for Petro, soft white flakes that covered the mud and blood and made the world look clean for a few hours before the tracks of boots and vehicles turned to black again. It was December 1941, and the German advance had stalled at the gates of Moscow. The blitzkrieg that had seemed unstoppable in summer now froze in the Russian winter. Wehrmacht soldiers huddled around fires in inadequate uniforms, their vehicles refusing to start in temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero. The invincible German army was learning what Napoleon had learned. Russia was vast, and winter was an enemy no tank could defeat. But in western Ukraine, the occupation tightened like a noose. Partisan activity had exploded across the region. Soviet soldiers who had escaped encirclement now fought from the forests, ambushing German supply convoys, executing collaborators, preparing for the counteroffensive that would eventually come. The Germans responded with savage collective punishment. For every German killed, they shot 50 civilians. For every act of sabotage, they burned entire villages. The population was trapped between competing terrors, each demanding absolute loyalty and punishing any suspected betrayal with death. Petro heard the motorcycle before he saw it. He was splitting wood behind the house when Schmidt arrived with 2 Ukrainian auxiliary police officers. Not Maxim this time. Maxim had been found hanging from a tree 3 weeks ago with a sign around his neck that read, "Death to traitors," in Ukrainian. Partisan work. His body had frozen solid before anyone dared to cut it down. Petro Kovalenko, Schmidt said through his interpreter, "You're under arrest for harboring enemies of the Reich." Oksana ran out of the house, her face stricken. He has done nothing. We have done nothing. Schmidt ignored her. He nodded to the auxiliary police, who grabbed Petro's arms and forced them behind his back. A Jewish child was found in the next village with papers saying he came from your district. The priest who provided the papers has confessed everything before he died. He gave us names. Your name, Father Dimitro, dead. Petro felt the words like physical blows. The old priest who had kept records of the dead, who had tried to save children, who had offered hope in a world designed to destroy it. Tortured until he spoke, then executed. Probably dozens of people were being arrested right now, based on whatever Schmidt had extracted from him. The child is safe. Petro asked. Schmidt's smile was thin and cruel. The child is dead. All of them are dead. You delayed the inevitable and condemned yourself in the process. You are a fool. They threw Petro into the back of a truck. Through the canvas flap, he saw Oksana standing in the snow, her hand raised in farewell or benediction. He memorized her face, knowing he would never see her again. The truck lurched forward, its engine grinding in the cold. Inside, 3 other men sat in silence, all arrested for various crimes against the Reich. One had been caught listening to Soviet radio. Another had refused to work in the German weapons factory they were building in the next town. The third would not say what he had done, but his hands were broken and his face was a mass of bruises. The truck did not go to the execution ravine. It went to the train station in the regional center where hundreds of people were being loaded into cattle cars. Petro recognized some of them. Teachers, farmers, former Soviet officials, intellectuals, anyone who might organize resistance. This was not execution. This was deportation. Forced labor in the Reich. The Germans needed workers for their factories since so many German men were dying at the front. Eastern Europeans were untermenschen, subhuman, in Nazi ideology, which made them perfect for slave labor. The cattle car was packed so tightly that Petro could barely breathe. The door slammed shut and locked from the outside. In the darkness, people wept and prayed and cursed. The train began to move, slowly at first, then faster. It would take them west, away from Ukraine, away from everything they knew, toward Germany and the camps where workers were used until they died, and then replaced with fresh shipments of slaves from the conquered territories. Petro closed his eyes and thought of Oksana. She was smart, resourceful, hard. The famine had made her strong. She would survive. She had to survive. Someone had to remember what had happened here, to bear witness to the terrible choices people had made when the world gave them only terrible options that he thought of David. Maybe Schmidt was lying. Maybe the boy had escaped. Maybe he was alive somewhere, hiding under a different name, carrying his mother's memory into a future none of them could imagine. Maybe saving one child meant something even if it cost everything. Through the gaps in the cattle car walls, Petro watched Ukraine slip away in fragments. Snow-covered fields where he had worked as a boy. Villages burning in the distance. German military columns moving toward the front. Soviet prisoners marching in long lines toward their own deaths. The war consumed everything, leaving only ash and frozen corpses and the shattered remnants of people who had tried to remain human in an inhuman time. In the spring of 1942, partisan activity intensified. Oksana Kovalenko disappeared from Kaladayas and was reported by neighbors to have fled to the forest. Some said she joined a Soviet partisan unit. Others said she joined Ukrainian nationalists who fought both the Germans and the Soviets, seeking independence from all outside powers. No official records confirm what happened to her. The Underground Railroad that saved Jewish children continued to operate despite German efforts to destroy it. Historians estimate that thousands of Ukrainian Christians risked their lives to hide Jewish neighbors, though many were caught and executed for their efforts. The story of these rescuers remained largely untold during the Soviet period because it complicated the narrative of Ukrainian collaboration that Moscow promoted. Petro Kovalenko's name appears in German labor camp records from 1942. He was assigned to a munitions factory in Bavaria. The records end in January 1943 with a notation that worker number 4,837 died of typhus. He was 41 years old. The village of Kaladayas was burned by retreating Germans in 1943. When Soviet forces reoccupied Ukraine, they arrested anyone suspected of collaborating with the occupation. Many villagers who had welcomed the Germans in 1941 out of desperate hope for relief from Soviet oppression were sent to gulags as traitors. The definition of collaboration was broad enough to include almost anyone who had survived under German rule. In 1991, when Ukraine finally gained independence after the Soviet Union collapsed, investigations began into both Soviet and Nazi crimes committed on Ukrainian soil. The full scope of the Holodomor famine was finally acknowledged publicly. The mass graves at Babin Yar and hundreds of other sites were excavated and memorialized. The names of those who saved Jews were recorded and honored, but no memorial exists for people like Petro Kovalenko, who made impossible choices in impossible times, who saved one child when they could not save thousands, who were crushed between empires that viewed them as expendable. Their stories exist only in fragments, in fading memories, in the complicated truth that history prefers to simplify. The snow that fell on Kolodyazin that December morning melted in spring and fell again the next winter and the winter after that, covering the mass graves and burned villages and frozen corpses until eventually, years later, grass grew green over the killing fields and children played where their grandparents had died, unaware of the ghosts beneath their feet, unaware of the terrible price paid for the crimes of men who claimed to be building paradise while creating hell on earth.